There are places where the walls remember, where every creak in the floor, every whisper in the dark, carries the weight of the dead. In the quiet, tree-lined towns of Pennsylvania, some families once called these places home. But these were no ordinary houses. They were funeral homes. Built generations ago, these houses were made to house the dead, to serve as resting places for bodies, awaiting burial. But over time, some of these funeral homes were sold, inherited, or abandoned, only to be occupied again by those who thought they could turn them into homes for the living. What they didn't know was that some walls never forget, and some doors should never be reopened. Today, you will hear 4 sinister accounts from families who dared to live inside these haunted relics. Houses where the smell of embalming fluid still lingers in the air, where shadows move against the light, and where the line between the living and the dead dissolves into something you cannot define. Every story is real. Every testimony comes from those who swore never to speak of what they experienced until now. So turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and listen carefully, because in the forgotten funeral homes of Pennsylvania, the dead don't rest. They remember. Story 1. The House on Willow Creek Road. They moved in on a cloudy afternoon in late October. The Harlow family, David, his wife Margaret, their 15-year-old daughter Emily, and their 6-year-old son, Ryan. It wasn't the home they had dreamed of, but it was what they could afford. Pennsylvania was expensive, and David had just started a new job at a small factory outside of town. The old house on Willow Creek Road had been sitting empty for years, but on paper, it looked perfect. Spacious, solid, with a big yard for the kids, and rent lower than anything else in the area. When they first toured it, Margaret noticed the faint chemical smell that clung to the basement, sharp, metallic, impossible to describe. The realtor brushed it off. "Probably just old paint," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The Harlows moved in that same weekend. The first few nights were quiet, but on the 5th night, Ryan woke up screaming. He said the walls were whispering. David told him it was just the wind. But when he pressed his ear against the dry wall later that night, he swore he heard something. Faint, like a muffled voice caught between the layers of plaster. Margaret began to notice other things. The air in the hallway outside their bedroom was colder than the rest of the house. Emily, who was in the middle of a rebellious phase, joked that the place smelled like dead people. Nobody laughed. On the 2nd week, strange knocks began, not on the doors, but inside the walls. Sometimes they were soft and rhythmic, as if someone was tapping from behind the wallpaper. Other times, they came all at once, a frantic burst that made Ryan cry and Emily storm out of her room, shouting that she was done with this creepy dump. David checked for rats, loose pipes, anything. He found nothing. By the 3rd week, the nightmares began. Margaret dreamed she was walking through the house at night, following the sound of dripping water. But when she turned the corner into the basement, she saw metal tables lined up in rows and something covered by white sheets. She tried to lift one, but when she touched the fabric, she woke up, gasping, drenched in sweat, with the echo of dripping still in her ears. Emily stopped sleeping in her own room. She told her mother that she kept waking up to the sound of someone breathing beside her bed. Slow, deliberate breaths just above the level of a whisper. One morning, David found her sitting in the kitchen at 4 a.m., staring out the window. When he asked what she was doing, she said, "I saw a man standing in the hallway last night. He looked confused." It wasn't until a month later that David finally decided to check the basement properly. The door had been sealed with an old padlock when they moved in. The landlord said it was unsafe, that the stairs were unstable. But David had grown tired of the noises, the drafts, the constant sense that something was wrong. He broke the lock open one Saturday morning. The air that came out was cold, colder than outside. The smell hit him first, disinfectant and rust. He took a flashlight, went down the creaking steps, and froze. At the far end of the room were 3 metal tables, rusted, stained. Beside them stood a wall of wooden cabinets, long, rectangular, each with a small brass plate. The plates had been scratched off, but the outline of names was still visible beneath the rust. Margaret came down after hearing him call her name. She stood beside him for a long time before whispering, "David, this isn't a basement." It wasn't. It was a prep room. That evening, David called their landlord, demanding an explanation. The man didn't answer. So he went to the county records office the next morning. The clerk looked up the address, frowned, and said quietly, "Sir, that property used to be a family-owned funeral home. It closed down in 1983 after an incident." When David pressed, she only said one more thing. They found something in the basement. They never told the public what it was. After that, things got worse. Emily refused to sleep in her room again. Ryan began sleepwalking, always stopping in front of the basement door. Margaret heard footsteps pacing below the floor when everyone was asleep. One night, she went down alone with a flashlight. Halfway down the stairs, the light flickered, and she heard a soft, steady drip. When she reached the tables, she realized the sound wasn't water. It was something else. A dark stain spread slowly across the metal, as if the table itself were bleeding. She ran. They packed up and left 2 days later, moving into a small apartment in town. A week after the Harlows had abandoned the house on Willow Creek Road, David returned for one final task: to hand over the keys to the new owner. The man who met him was quiet, reserved, with a gaze that kept flicking toward the windows of the house. He seemed uneasy. As David approached, the man spoke in a low, almost hesitant voice. "Strange place," he said. "The neighbors warned me about it. It used to be a funeral home, and apparently one of the morticians who lived here back in the early 80s had a family." David paused. "Lived here? You mean, as in, after it was a funeral home?" The man nodded. "Yes. A wife and 2 children, a teenage girl and a small boy. The neighbors say they both died here. No one knows exactly how. Some of the locals refuse to even walk past the front gate after dark." At that moment, David's pulse quickened. His hands went clammy. He wanted to ask their names, but something instinctively stopped him. The air felt heavier, charged, almost watching. Then, just for a brief second, as the late afternoon sun struck the windows at an angle, he swore he saw 2 figures standing inside, a small boy and a teenage girl, side by side, unmoving, staring directly at him. He blinked. They were gone. The man asked if he was all right. David didn't answer. He handed over the keys, his fingers trembling slightly, and turned toward his truck. As he drove away, he noticed something in the air inside his car, the same faint metallic chemical scent that had haunted the house. He rolled down the windows, but the smell lingered, stubborn and unnatural. Investigators would later note that those who leave the house often report it a lingering, inexplicable odor of embalming fluid, even miles away. Some believe it's a psychological echo of the building's past. Others aren't so sure. For David Harlow, the experience would remain with him forever, because in that old funeral home in Pennsylvania, the walls remembered everything, and sometimes they don't let go. Story 2. The night guard Ethan had just graduated from college, unsure of his future, struggling to make ends meet. A small classified ad caught his attention. Night guard needed, flexible hours, Pennsylvania funeral home. At first, he hesitated. The pay was decent, the schedule ideal for a part-time student job, but the location, an old, nearly century-old funeral home, gave him pause. The building stood at the edge of a quiet town, shrouded in fog and trees that clawed at its brick facade. Its history was whispered among locals. An early 20th century family-run mortuary, closed for renovations decades ago, partially reopened for a few remaining clients. Ethan brushed it off. It's just a job, he told himself. He didn't know that stepping inside would pull him into a world that time had tried to bury. A world where the living were never meant to linger after dusk. The first night was deceptively quiet. Ethan walked the hallways, flashlight in hand, clipboard and keys dangling from his belt. The air smelled faintly of formaldehyde, an odor that made him wrinkle his nose and adjust his breathing. Nothing happened at first. No flickering lights, no footsteps, no voices. He checked the offices, the preparation rooms, even the tiny chapel in the back. Everything seemed normal until he reached the basement. A soft click echoed somewhere behind the walls. Not mechanical, not random, deliberate. Ethan froze. His flashlight beam shook slightly. "Hello?" he called, voice quivering. Only silence answered. As he climbed back to the main floor, a shadow moved at the corner of his vision. He spun, flashlight slicing through the darkness. Nothing. A simple trick of light, he told himself. Or exhaustion. By the end of the first week, Ethan began noticing subtle but unsettling changes. Objects moved on their own. A ledger misplaced, a small tool lying across the floor, where it hadn't been earlier. Marks appeared on walls, long vertical scratches, as if someone had been pacing behind the drywall. A faint humming sometimes filled the empty halls, almost musical, almost deliberate. Ethan's nights became restless. He started keeping a journal, recording every sound, every smell, every flicker of light. Each entry made the house feel heavier, as though it were aware he was documenting it. The real terror began with the dreams. Ethan dreamed of the house itself. In the dreams, he walked endlessly through the halls, the air thick and cold. The tables in the prep rooms gleamed in a light that had no source. Shadows moved behind him, just out of reach. A voice whispered names he didn't recognize, and the sound of chains dragging across floors followed him wherever he went. He woke in a cold sweat each night, heart racing, only to hear the faintest echoes from the real halls, footsteps pacing above him, doors gently clicking, and the unmistakable sound of someone breathing nearby. After 2 weeks, Ethan explored a section of the building he hadn't seen, a locked door at the end of a narrow corridor. No map, no blueprint indicated it existed. Curiosity mixed with unease drove him to force it open. Inside was a small, windowless room, the air pungent with chemicals and decay. Rows of old lockers and cabinets lined the walls. Inside some, he found artifacts from previous employees, old ID badges, worn shoes, faded jackets. Some cabinets were empty, but marked with dates and names. Dates and names he recognized from old news clippings. Former night guards who had mysteriously disappeared over the decades. The realization hit him like ice water. The funeral home didn't just store the dead. It kept the living too, those who lingered too long in the night. It was Ethan's 3rd week at the funeral home, when the house seemed to change completely. The air grew heavier, as though every corridor, every hallway, every room carried a weight it had never carried before. That night, he arrived early for his shift, flashlight in hand, notebook at the ready. But something was different the moment he stepped inside. The entrance door, which had always groaned when opened, swung silently. The familiar smell of formaldehyde hit him first, stronger than ever, as though the house had concentrated it while he was away. By midnight, the noises began. First subtle, a soft tapping behind the walls, measured, almost like someone counting seconds. Then it escalated, footsteps pacing above him, though he knew the second floor was empty. A faint humming emerged from the chapel, low and rhythmic, like a choir singing just beneath hearing. Ethan stopped in the corridor and shined his flashlight down the hall. The beam trembled as he took a step forward. A door at the far end, the same door that led to the mysterious locked room he had explored, creaked open by itself. Something compelled him to approach. Inside, the small windowless room looked different. The lockers and cabinets had shifted positions slightly, though he had noted their arrangement in his journal. Dust had been disturbed, as if someone, or something, had moved through the space recently. And then he saw them. The artifacts, old employee badges, and personal items from the previous guards were lined up on the floor. Each one now had a small, dark stain on it, almost like dried wax or rust. But Ethan knew deep in his gut, it wasn't accidental. A whisper broke the silence. "Stay." Ethan froze. The sound was soft but unmistakable, coming from all directions at once. He could feel the weight of invisible eyes on his back, the cold brush of air along his neck, like fingers he couldn't see. He stumbled toward the door, flashlight shaking. Passing a polished metal cabinet, he caught his reflection, or what he thought was his reflection. It wasn't him. The figure staring back was older, gaunt, hollow-eyed, his face pale, lips cracked, eyes dark as pits. And behind him, other shapes emerged from the shadows, lingering just out of focus. Men, women, children, silent, waiting, trapped in the walls of the house. Ethan's heart pounded. He ran. He reached the front door and flung it open. Outside, the autumn wind bit at his face, carrying the faintest odor of embalming fluid. He never looked back. He resigned the next morning, vowing never to return. But when he recounted his experience, he learned something disturbing from a local historian. The funeral home had a record of missing night guards over decades, employees who were never found after extended overnight shifts. Some were listed as left without notice, some as disappeared. None had ever returned. Ethan didn't speak of it publicly for months, but months later, he began receiving handwritten notes slipped under his apartment door. Each note had a single word: waiting. And sometimes, when he walked past mirrors late at night, he swore he saw a shadow lingering just behind him, following silently, patient, eternal. Narrator. For Ethan, the house wasn't just a building. It was a silent witness, a keeper of the night, a reminder that in some places, the living are never entirely free. Story 3. The House That Knew Too Much. The Carters were no strangers to death. For 3 generations they had run a small but respected funeral business in Pennsylvania. David Carter, the father, was meticulous with his records. His wife, Eleanor, had learned the delicate art of embalming from her mother. Their children, Clara and little Sam, had grown up in a world of quiet rooms, polished caskets, and soft whispers of mourning. When they first heard about the house on Ashwood Lane, built in 1942 as a private funeral home, they thought it was perfect. Spacious, sturdy, affordable, and importantly, a place where their family business could expand into a new location. Upon arrival, the house seemed almost frozen in time. Dark wood floors, heavy velvet curtains, long hallways that echoed every footstep. Dust motes hung in the air, like tiny floating memories of decades past. The smell was faint at first. Old wood, faintly metallic, almost antiseptic, familiar enough that none of them thought much of it. Yet, as they stepped inside, a subtle tension lingered in the air, the kind of heaviness that seems to watch you, measure you, test your presence. The first few nights were quiet, almost deceptively so. But the Carters were sensitive to the nuances of a funeral home. David noticed small things immediately. The way the floorboards creaked in patterns that didn't align with the structure, or how certain rooms seemed colder, even with the heating on. Clara, 15, noticed shadows that didn't match the furniture or her movements. Sam, 6, insisted he saw figures standing in the corners of the hallways. He would smile nervously and whisper, "They're just watching." Eleanor tried to rationalize it. "It's the house settling. The wind. The pipes," she would say. But deep down, she knew that even with all her experience, there was something different about this place. Objects moved on their own. A ledger on David's desk would be upside down in the morning. Chairs shifted slightly. Small tools left on a prep table were gone, and then returned in strange arrangements. Then came the whispers, soft at first, almost imperceptible. A low murmur that seemed to drift along the hallways, rising and falling, as if the house itself were breathing or speaking. One evening, Clara found an old photograph tucked behind a panel in the study. It showed the original owners of the house, a mortician, his wife, and 2 children. The date stamped on the back read 1945. The more the Carters explored, the more they discovered remnants of the past. Diaries, embalming tools, ledgers with meticulous records of every funeral held, notes about families they had never heard of, clients whose names had long since disappeared from local archives. David realized something chilling. The house itself was a repository of memory. Every person who had entered, every body prepared, every mourner that had walked its floors seemed to have left an imprint, a faint echo that lingered in the wood and plaster. The family began experiencing strange phenomena. Clara heard footsteps pacing above her while she lay in bed. Sam claimed that tiny hands brushed his back as he walked through the halls. Eleanor saw faint reflections in mirrors that didn't align with her own movements, shadows that lingered longer than they should. Even for a family so familiar with death, the feeling was unlike anything they had ever encountered, as if the house itself were alive, observing, remembering, and stinning them. The tension built gradually over weeks. One stormy night, the electricity flickered, plunging the house into darkness. The Carters huddled in the main parlor, flashlight beams cutting through the shadows. Every creak, every whisper, every subtle movement in the corners of the room seemed amplified, as though the house was reacting to their presence. David decided it was time to investigate further. He examined the basement, a cramped, windowless space with shelves of old chemicals and embalming equipment. Behind a false panel, he discovered a small hidden room that had been untouched for decades. Inside were rows of cabinets, meticulously organized. Inside, some were embalming tools, old gloves, and worn notebooks. But one detail froze him. Several cabinets bore the names of employees from past generations of the funeral business, including names that matched his own records of distant relatives who had worked in the trade. The house was cataloging everyone who entered its walls. That night, during another blackout, Clara and Sam were in the hall when they suddenly froze. "There," Clara whispered, pointing toward the corridor. 2 faint figures appeared. Children, shadowed, translucent, watching. Sam whispered, "They're waiting for us." David and Eleanor rushed to them. But the hallway was empty when they approached. Yet the cold, unmistakable presence lingered. Lights flickered, doors banged softly, and the smell of formaldehyde grew pungent, concentrated, unnatural. The family felt eyes on them from every direction. Every creak of wood, every whispering breath seemed deliberate, sentient. Eleanor's voice trembled. "We're not alone in here." "Not really." The next morning, the Carters explored the hidden room further. Among the ledgers and tools, they found a diary belonging to the original mortician. It described the meticulous documentation of every visitor, every body, every employee. It spoke of the house as if it had a mind of its own. It remembers what is done here. It sees those who enter. Some are welcomed, others are claimed. For a family that had worked in funeral homes for decades, accustomed to the routines of death, this was something entirely new. The house did not just store the dead, it remembered the living. The Carters left the house that day, shaken to their core. They moved their family business elsewhere, but the memory of the house, its heavy silence, its hidden rooms, the eyes in the shadows, lingered in their minds forever. Even today, when a breeze passes through their new offices, Eleanor swears she feels the watchful presence of Ashwood Lane, silently observing, recording, waiting. In houses like these, even those who have faced death daily can find themselves unsettled, tested by the echoes of the past. Because some buildings do more than shelter the dead. They hold the living accountable. And some memories, once imprinted, never fade. Story 4. Shelter of Shadows. It was the dead of winter in Pennsylvania. The snow fell relentlessly, coating the streets with a thick, suffocating silence. Marlon, a man accustomed to the cold and the endless nights outdoors, wandered aimlessly through the deserted streets, searching for a place to escape the bitter wind. At the edge of town, partially hidden behind overgrown bushes and leaning trees, he noticed the old funeral home. Its brick facade was cracked, windows shattered, some boarded, others broken, but eerily transparent in the moonlight. A faint glow of the street lamp brushed the doorway, inviting him in, almost like a silent plea for entry. Marlon hesitated. He had seen plenty of abandoned buildings before, places where people had lived, or worse, places where people had died and been forgotten. But something about this house, the way it stood, rigid, silent, almost expectant, drew him closer. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was still, heavy, carrying the unmistakable chemical tang of embalming fluids, mixed with the mustiness of decades of abandonment. Dust hung like mist in the narrow beams of light, piercing the broken windows. He could feel the weight of the house, a presence that seemed to settle around him, as if watching, measuring, and judging his intrusion. Marlon made his way deeper into the funeral home, seeking a corner to rest. The floorboards groaned under his weight, echoing through the hallways in patterns that didn't match his steps. At first he thought it was just the old house settling, but then came the whispers, soft, almost inaudible at first, low murmurs drifting down the hallways, rising and falling with a rhythm that seemed deliberate, as if the house were speaking to him, testing his courage. He froze. Every hair on his neck stood on end. His eyes darted to the shadows. The hallways were empty, yet he felt movement, subtle and deliberate, just beyond the reach of his flashlight. A mirror in the corner reflected more than just his own image. Behind him, a shadowy figure shifted, its features indistinct, but the sense of being observed was undeniable. Marlon spun. Nothing. Only the faint echo of a footstep somewhere above him answered his heart's rapid pounding. Curiosity and survival propelled him forward. He explored the second floor, where the broken windows allowed slivers of icy moonlight to illuminate the long corridors. There, partially hidden behind an old cabinet, he noticed a door with rusted hinges and scratches along its frame. It had no markings, no label, no indication it had ever been there. Driven by equal parts dread and necessity, Marlon forced it open. Inside was a small, windowless room, unmistakably a necroterio. Rows of cabinets and shelves lined the walls, some containing old embalming tools, jars, and chemicals. Dust-covered ledgers were stacked neatly, and he noticed faded human remains preserved under the grime of decades. Marlon's stomach churned. He had lived among death before, but this was different. There was a sense of ritual, of meticulous record-keeping, almost obsessive. The names in the ledgers matched missing persons from decades past, people never accounted for, families that had vanished quietly from the town. The longer he lingered, the more the house seemed to respond. Doors banged softly on their own. Objects shifted, small tools and dusty jars sliding across tables as if guided by unseen hands. The faint, almost melodic hum of the house grew louder, vibrating through the floor, the walls, and even the air he breathed. Marlon felt eyes on him. Everywhere he turned, shadows seemed to collect at the edges of the room, following him. He tried to rationalize it, the wind, the creaking wood, his own imagination. Yet the feeling persisted. The air grew heavier, the smell of embalming fluid stronger, almost suffocating. When he dared glance back at the mirrors along the corridor, he saw them. Figures standing behind him, reflected perfectly in glass, yet vanishing when he spun around. The storm outside intensified. Snow drummed against the broken windows, wind howling through the cracks, as if the house itself was whispering in harmony. Marlon realized he was not alone. A subtle movement drew his attention to the far end of the hall. Shadows twisting, forming shapes that resembled human figures. They were unmoving, patient, watching him. A low, almost imperceptible chant seemed to fill the room, repeating words he couldn't understand, yet somehow recognized as names of the disappeared. Panic surged. He ran toward the front door, but the layout of the house had shifted in subtle ways. Hallways that should have led outside now twisted back on themselves. Doors that had been open were locked. The house was alive, testing him, trapping him in its memory. Somehow, after what felt like hours, Marlon found a window and climbed out into the snow, freezing, gasping, trembling. Behind him, the house seemed to sigh, a heavy, mournful exhalation that followed him into the cold night. The next day, the local authorities inspected the building. They found evidence that the funeral home had been used for illegal purposes decades earlier, with bodies of missing persons stored secretly, meticulously catalogued, and hidden from the public. Marlon became one of the few people alive to witness the house in its full, terrifying memory. He told his story cautiously, aware that many would dismiss it as the imagination of a homeless man in a freezing night. But for him, the memory lingered. The whispering walls, the watching shadows, the precise, calculated way the house seemed to measure every step he took. Even now, he avoids that street. Yet sometimes, when the wind carries a faint chemical scent through the city, he swears he can hear the soft, deliberate hum of Ashwood Lane's forgotten house, still keeping its silent vigil over those who dare enter. Some houses store the dead, others store memories of the living. And in certain places, the past is never truly gone. It waits, patiently, silently, and sometimes it reaches out. As the shadows of these old funeral homes linger in your mind, remember, the stories don't end here. If tonight's tales sent chills down your spine, there are many more waiting in the darkness, each one more unsettling than the last. Subscribe and join us in the shadows. Share your thoughts. Comment below if you've ever felt the presence of the past, and dare to listen to more stories that haunt the forgotten corners of the world.